Hassanein. Hi. We're being recorded. And I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. And I just wanted, before I turn it over to these folks who say they want to introduce themselves, which is great. I wanted to give a little bit of context to this, and that is that Max Milton and I occasionally get a chance to catch up, and we inevitably talk about land use planning. And there's Max now. So Max, I'm giving a little background on this panel idea, and that was that you know, Max and I have really over the years talked quite a bit about the value of planning and for sustainability and for healthy communities. And with the so-called housing crisis that's occurring in many of our communities in Montana, Max and I started talking about, you know, the concern that housing starts to eclipse our other values and issues that we care about, so which are critical to not only sustainability but our ability to, as communities, to be resilient in the face of climate change. And so this panel kind of came out of some conversations that Max and I had and then shared with Jillian. And so we were hoping to get at some key questions here regarding building sustainable communities, balancing different values and goals, and what are some of the innovative approaches that we can take in this regard. So we're going to start off with Garrett McAllister, who is, I'm happy to say, an alumnus of the Environmental Studies program, and now works with Bozeman Planning Office. And they said they wanted to introduce themselves, so that's about all I'm going to say first. We'll start with Garrett, and then we'll go to Schwend and Amaia. What's your last name again?
Sangroniz.
Amaia.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Oh, sure. I guess,
It doesn't matter either way.
do we want to introduce ourselves and then come back to me?
No.
Okay. All right. So my name is Garrett McAllister. I am the community development manager for Gallatin County. Our office is in Bozeman, but we work in the county, the unincorporated parts of the county, which includes Big Sky, all the way down towards West Yellowstone, and then north quite a ways as well. It's a very large county. If you know anything about Gallatin. My job really is to identify and sort of manage long-range planning goals for the county. And we've done a lot of recent plans. We've had a growth policy update, which I'll talk about a little bit. Transportation planning, non-motorized transportation plan, a trails plan for the Triangle area. There's a lot of growth in the Triangle, which is the area, if you're familiar with Gallatin Valley, Bozeman, Four Corners, and Belgrade, kind of our fastest growing area that we call the Triangle. It doesn't really look like a triangle, but so I guess when I was invited to come give this talk, I kind of just started thinking about my role and how we think about affordable housing and agriculture and some of these things from kind of a long-range planning perspective and policy making. And so I think where my mind went is the foundation of a lot of this work, I think from a land use perspective, is just good policy making. And so I want to talk a little bit about the growth policy, which is the comprehensive plan. I don't know why Montana calls it a growth policy. It's the only state that I know of. Every other state, it's usually a comprehensive plan. So anyway, we have a few themes in our plan. We have opportunity, open space, and then heritage is one of them. And this sort of captures some of those cultural values around cultural and historical significant places, that sort of Western community character, working lands, natural areas, etc. I won't go through all the goals or the policies, but I just kind of wanted to show this document. It's a document that we worked really hard on. Started before the pandemic happened and sort of did what it did to everybody. But we sort of made it through, and I think we came out the other side with a really great foundational planning and policy document. So we have a whole bunch of policies around agriculture, around the goal of protecting the right to farm and ranch, and what that looks like at a countywide scale, protecting soil quality, increasing, this is a new one that we added, agriculture goal 3 is to increase production of and support access to locally sourced food.
Yes.
So how that actually happens, we don't necessarily know right now. That's sort of in our next phase of implementing this plan through our future land use map. And so hopefully we'll get there, but we have like I said, sort of a solid foundation for knowing what we want to support in the future. We also have some housing policies. I'm not sure how much we'll talk about housing, but I just figured I'd at least throw that in there. And then one of the resources that we have is our primary criteria maps in Montana. Whenever you get subdivision, there's primary criteria that you have to consider. There's 7 of them, and you have to consider the subdivision's impacts on those 7 different primary criteria. And one of them is agriculture. And so the area that I'm kind of talking about, focused on today, the triangle, our highest growth area. The slide to the right, you can see where Belgrade is, Bozeman is, and then Four Corners is where the kind of roads come together on the sort of left-hand side. Yeah. But the dark green is all prime farmland and really high quality soils. So our highest growth areas in the county are also right over the top of our best soils. So that's been tricky, and we're trying to figure out how we can manage development and growth, but do it in a way that protects some of those important agricultural lands. And then just another sort of slide showing the growth. This is basically a heat map of density of structures mapped since 2003. We picked 2003 because that was the last time we had updated the growth policy prior to this one in 2021. And so you can see where the dark blue blobs are in the triangle. There's just been an incredible amount of growth development. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
We're supposed to keep it short, right?
Yeah, that was really
Okay.
short. Okay, awesome. So now I'm wondering if I can slide that over, because I decided to torture you with doing some animated slides, so rather than saying hit it.
Okay.
So here we go. Yeah, don't move. Don't move, Garrett.
Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Ann Schwend, and I work with the Montana Environmental Information Center. They started a new program last year called Sustainable Communities. And they said, we're really excited to have you on board. And we want you to work on land use planning and water planning and affordable housing. I was like, great. That sounds like a pretty good suite of opportunities. And then sent me off to the legislature to basically try to advocate for all of those. My background prior to coming to MEIC was working as a water planner for the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation for 14 years. But I also volunteered on the Madison County Planning Board for 10 years and the Consolidated City of Helena and Lewis and Clark County Planning Board. So I have a little bit of experience with the land use planning, more experience with the water. But mostly what I'm really interested in is what's that nexus look like between water and land use planning and thinking about our future. I think probably if we'd given Neva a little more time at the beginning, she may have talked about growth. We all know that Montana is growing rapidly. And so when we have this conversation about sustainable community, what does that look like for us? And I think about that even as I was starting my job. I'm like, what do we mean by a sustainable community? And I think Garrett just did a great job. It's a community that's planning for its future, that really identifies resources and concerns and maybe thinks about the way that they want to grow. Climate friendly and environmentally conscientious, that's a pretty laudable goal. It's a little bit challenging in this day and age with how rapidly we are growing. One of the biggest areas that I'm seeing, and I hope I'll kind of line this out for you, is this problem where we are encouraging more growth and sprawl out into the counties and away from our urban core areas, which is, if we're trying to meet that climate friendly goal, we really need to be thinking about our urban core areas. Because as we sprawl into the areas outside of the urban core, we're sort of infringing on open space, our water resources, ag land, as we're all concerned, and wildlife habitat. You know, if you think about the reason that many of the people move to Montana, it's because they love the open space, and then they immediately buy a parcel and 10 acres and then put a giant house on it and roads and utilities and infrastructure to get there. Communities, what makes a community sustainable is that they are resilient and that they are adaptable to incremental change. This is one of the things that I'm really seeing a lot, particularly in our legislature or in local planning divisions. People really don't want it to change. They all say, okay, well, I'm pretty happy with the way this looks, and I love my neighborhood and the neighborhood character. But that causes a problem if we are thinking about how to put more people in our urban areas. And I think maybe Diana might be chatting with us a little bit about some community resiliency. The other piece is considering long-term affordability. And I use that term because affordability keeps coming up, and we all talk about affordable housing. And I think everybody has sort of a different vision of what that means. But affordability should mean a place that you can comfortably call home, and that you don't have to rely on your vehicle. And you don't have to worry about how great your utility bills are going to be, that it may actually price you out of a home. So thinking about energy sustainability, right? And that we have a diversity of housing options. Not everyone needs exactly the same thing. And to create community, we really need to think about what are all those housing options. Sorry, I saw this in my old files, and it's an old Duck Boy postcard, and I thought it was pretty classic. Land use planning in Montana, that is actually the way that we're doing it most of the time. It's pretty reactive. The people are coming in and we're like, oh crap, where are we going to put them? You know, and what does that need to look like? And so we aren't really thinking comprehensively about what we might do. So quickly, just a couple of considerations, and this is trying to get us into this land and water, the challenge that I see with our planning right now and with creating these communities. Local jurisdictions. Garrett is from Gallatin County, but the city of Bozeman has very different rules and considerations when there is planning going on in the city. And what happens is that oftentimes the county and the city are not necessarily communicating with each other, nor do they have the same goals or the same issues or concerns. And so that creates kind of a rub. It's a little bit of a challenge, particularly in that growth edge, kind of that area where a city is beginning to expand out. And how do they coordinate with the county, and how do we have our laws and our policies match that? State agencies, in particular, I work for Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. They're looking at water quantity only. The Department of Environmental Quality looks at water quality. The two don't necessarily coordinate or have the same goals and issues. And so when we talk about water resources, there's a very different lens for the way that the agencies are reviewing subdivision applications that are occurring in the counties. And then you have the legislature. And I think I'll just leave it at that. It's very, very difficult. And I'm not trying to throw them under the bus. The legislature meets in a very short time frame, and they are making policy decisions on the fly. And they often don't have good information or good understanding of what the real issues might be. And so they're creating policy that then the local county or city, the counties generally have to enact. It's a little preemptive. But there's a whole political will discussion that we could go on for days about. And then the piece about affordability. So sorry, this slide's a little bit junky, but what kinds of things are driving this sprawl development? And if we look at one hand, in our cities and in our urban areas, you have fewer sites for development, right? You have fewer lots that are available for new development. There might be some redevelopment. So the projects are smaller. So if you're a developer, put your developer hat on for a minute and you're like, okay, I want to be making pretty good business. I want to be making reasonable money on my investment. If you're in the city, the zoning is more restrictive. You're hooking up to city utilities. You have rules going back to the zoning. Maybe it's single family residential and you can't do multifamily housing or mixed use housing in specific areas if there are lots available. There are lot size, sometimes there are minimum lot sizes. There was a bill this session to eliminate minimum lot sizes for single family residential. Right? It was in Billings, the minimum lot size for a single family residential is 10,000 square feet. How do we accommodate more people in an urban area if you have a minimum lot size that creates this giant buffer around everyone's homes, right? You're not allowing for other people to move in. On the other hand, in rural areas or subdivisions that are in the county, there are more building locations. You can do a larger project. Your land costs are less. It costs less for the developer to do the development out there because they are not required to install the infrastructure for the water and sewer projects. That generally falls on the homeowner, especially if they're using an individual exempt well and a septic system. So the land cost is less, the utility cost is less, and the return on investment might be higher for those developers. So they have incentives. It's easier for them to do a project outside of town. But what happens is that ends up costing the city services more money without actually having that tax base that's there and available. So we have this disincentive to build in the city and more incentives to build out in the country. And if we think about what's happening as those parcels, as we're developing that land in the country, we are really impacting our agricultural lands and the availability of open space. Impacts to water resources. I need to talk about this for just a minute because I just said exempt wells. And basically, our water policy in the state right now, in many parts of the state, you cannot get a new water right to put a community public water system in. So developers often go to using an exempt well, and they're saying, we're going to design this subdivision and every house is going to have its own well, and each homeowner is going to have to build or put in their own well. There's no guarantee that there is water available or how deep they're going to have to go. But the problem comes in if they're using individual septic systems as well. The Department of Environmental Quality says you can't have your well and septic near each other, right? You have to have some distance because you don't want to be pumping your drain field effluent. But you also have to have distance from your neighbor. And so it requires a minimum lot size of 1 acre. So as we're building, we're requiring that every new parcel, every new lot that's on its own well and septic has to be at least 1 acre. So we're consuming land and we're sort of just rolling out across the countryside because our policies are driving that. And it's creating a car culture, which, going back to environmentally conscientious, transportation emissions are the #1 carbon producer in the state of Montana, driving around. So if we want to reduce our carbon emissions, we've got to get people out of their cars. They need to be living in what I would call a 15-minute city where they can walk to work and they can walk to school. And the last thing I would say on this is kind of this community fabric. As people move further apart from each other, I think that our fabric begins to fray a little bit. If you think about this cloth or this tapestry that we're weaving of community members and people living next door to each other and helping one another, You've got if you're in a tight knit area, you may have more community fabric than you want, but but as we get further apart, I think it allows more anonymity and you're sort of not creating a sustainable community. So it's time for us to rethink some of our policies that are driving this and reconsider how do we accommodate more people in less space in our urban areas on existing public utilities. And I'll leave it at that. Do you want to
Yeah.
call this up? All right. Put you in the hot seat.
Probably don't.
Alrighty, so my name is Amaia Sangroniz. I am now a adjunct faculty in the Sustainable Food and Bioenergy Systems Department at Montana State, but I also did my master's in graduate program, Sustainable Food Systems, and I researched agrihoods. So building off a question that was posed to us by Jillian and the ERA folks, is there an intersection between thoughtful community design and rebuilding Montana's food self-reliance? And if so, what might that look like? So as we have already discussed, we are seeing a lot of this happening. Our prime agricultural lands, the best soil in Montana, the best soil in Gallatin Valley being swallowed up and converted to suburbs, really being swallowed up and converted to housing development. And as we talked about, housing is absolutely necessary, but it is costing us our prime agricultural lands. So how can we rethink this, and how can we rethink our community developments to meet both the challenges of preserving our agricultural lands while also housing people? A couple other things regarding existing initiatives and strategies for the city of Bozeman. We are in a restructuring phase of the Unified Development Code, and there has been a lot of pushback at various meetings, but a strategy there is to really, remove restrictions and promote more infill and urban density, especially in our residential areas, and to limit this urban sprawl that we're seeing so much of. And we're also really trying to address affordable housing. Currently, the biggest strategies are these HUD vouchers, which we know as like Section 8, Section 9. We've recently had an ordinance pass regarding short-term rentals, urban camping. So we really are focusing on this housing issue. But what we see much less of is advocacy on behalf of agricultural preservation. There are also conversations happening with the city and the county regarding the establishment of a public housing authority as a potential strategy to promote and build long-term permanent affordable housing. And I'm super happy to take questions on what a public housing authority might look like, what social housing could be envisioned as in Bozeman, if we have questions at the end. But what is an agrihood? So this has come up already earlier in Neva's presentation, but it's really a planned development model that incorporates food production into new developments for sustainable development in our rapidly urbanizing areas. So most agrihoods, especially that we see in the United States, are planned with agriculture activities in mind. That could be surrounding a typical working farm, but we can also see it utilizing more of our urban agricultural strategies, our infill strategies, so to speak. So greenhouses, street tree planting, city park, food forestry, and the like, but really kind of could look at both ways as more of a, we're developing housing around a farm, and we know that we're going to do that from the get-go, or we are using infill strategies. So how can we incorporate more agriculture into our existing developments and our existing zones? So why are agrihoods a strategy? Because as we've talked about, urbanization pressure is really impacting our land availability. Agrihoods can provide a multitude of social, economic benefits. We've talked so much about the importance of getting people back and connected to their local food system. So agrihoods could certainly be a strategy to bring people in their communities to the fields, to have more of that stake in their food production and in their food system. And we also need to really ramp up our local food production. So the climate plan that Bozeman put out in 2020 really has that strategy to cultivate robust localized food systems. So agrihoods could be one strategy to improve our local food production and feed the people within the community that the food is actually being grown. So ultimately, this led me to the development of my graduate research question. So what are the barriers and opportunities to agrihood development in the Rocky Mountain region of the United States, using Bozeman as a case study, and also looking at a rapidly urbanizing part of Colorado as a case study as well. So in the exploration of this question, I spoke to city planners, local developers, local agriculturalists, and those involved with the city sustainability board. Some general themes when looking at the barriers and opportunities were labor, ownership and governance structures, resource availability, and land use regulation. So land use regulation in Bozeman came up time and time again because we have these very strict zoning laws. And again, as we're looking at our unified development code, looking at limiting some of the barriers to promote more agricultural activities within our city limits, because currently they are not permitted in many of our residential and high density zones. When we talk about opportunities regarding labor, we definitely see a link and a lot of folks that mentioned land access for beginning farmers. So we're thinking about new entrant farmers, beginning farmers, those that may not have the initial capital to invest in a parcel of land, especially in Gallatin County, which is very expensive. This could be an opportunity where the developer or the HOA would have ownership of the farm, and then a newer entrant farmer could come in and actually manage and grow the food. But with that being said, some other opportunities and barriers is that this is an ill-defined ownership and governance structure. So who's going to own the farm? Who's going to manage it? Is this going to be reliant on engaged community volunteers? Where are the funding sources? Who will be responsible? That ill-defined nature of what it could look like is definitely perceived as a barrier, but also could be an opportunity because it provides diversity in farm ownership and management and potential access. Resource availability, so always coming back to that high cost of land, competing ideas for what the best use of any given parcel of land could be. And then land use regulation, of course, our land use codes prohibiting agricultural activities in many areas, but with conversations with the city, they are looking at ways to minimize those barriers. One way being, currently we have height restrictions for how high our buildings can be in Bozeman, because of course we love our mountain views, but could we change those restrictions and allow a little bit more height in order to do maybe some rooftop greenhouses, rooftop gardens, things like that. So these are all existing conversations being had with the city of Bozeman. How can we maybe shift around some of those restrictions? This is the quote I really like talking to a city of Bozeman planner. So again, everyone has a competing idea for what the best use of any given piece of land could look like. Land is going to get eaten up for development, and we're very much in a housing crisis. So from the sustainability standpoint, it's a hard challenge to say what is the biggest need of our community and what's the most sustainable use of any given property. Again, sustainability perspective, limiting sprawl, a lot of folks from the city trying to have that density. So a given piece of land, we might see more sustainability coming from densifying our housing, having more closed apartment complexes, more units, versus preserving the agricultural land around a community to develop food. Really competing ideas for what the best use of any given piece of land could be. And then another barrier that was often cited is our shorter growing season. So if we only have 4, 5, maybe 6 months to grow food, is the best use of land holding off, 10 acres of an entire development project for agricultural activity. Some of us may say, yes, we want that agricultural land to stay in development, especially if it's in these prime soil areas in that peri-urban space outside of the heart of Bozeman. So yes, that certainly comes up as we might need to focus on density. This land could have more productivity if it did utilized high tunnel greenhouses, vertical farming, other indoor kind of more urban agricultural or infill methods. So that was another thing that was commonly cited. Why would we hold 10 acres in the middle of a development for greenfield traditional farming if that's only going to be productive a certain amount of months of the year? So again, the opportunity really coming back to infill agricultural strategies. So we have maybe some spaces within our city plots that could be converted to community gardens. We have rooftop gardens or greenhouses, and then also maybe some food forestry in our park spaces. All new developments do require a certain amount of open space and park space. So can we utilize some of that open space requirement to incorporate some fruiting shrubs, fruiting trees, community gardens? If that requirement is there, how can we utilize it to be more productive? And maybe utilizing fruit trees instead of just shade trees is another option. So kind of to end, this is a proposed development happening in Bozeman. So this whole conversation started because the Sustainable Food Systems Program at Montana State was approached by some local developers looking to create an agrihood. So they said, hey, what do you all think the best use of this land could be? What are some strategies you all have in mind? And they were really excited about, they had this 100+ acre area down Hassanein, or right in between Bozeman and Four Corners. And they said, we want to build an agrihood. We know that this has rich agricultural history. The soil quality of this space is amazing. How can we build an agrihood here? And we had a lot of conversations about it, but ultimately when they came to the city, they were met with, we want density in that space. So ultimately, it has shifted to a new vision where they are going to incorporate a year-round greenhouse vertical farm in lieu of preserving that agricultural land for production. So that is ultimately where they are now, and we're about to begin that development. And it is some mixed use zonings here. So we have part of that 106 acres being high density residential, we have some of it being commercial, and we also have residential emphasis mixed use district in that as well. But ultimately they did have the vision to preserve a big chunk of that 106 acres for agriculture, and it has since shifted based on feedback from the city. So that is something to be mindful and thinking of. This is going to be Bozeman's quote unquote first agrihood. So potentially laying a new narrative for what sustainable development in Bozeman could look like, but this vision has shifted quite a bit. So ultimately some opportunities, land use planning, long range planning, restructuring our regulatory zoning, especially as the UDC is in a draft phase right now. They really are looking to protect agricultural lands and integrate more infill, more urban agriculture into our existing residential areas. And ultimately there's a huge opportunity to collaborate with food systems professionals and planners to secure land for agriculture in our long range efforts. And I thought this was an important note to end on, is kind of a call to action for civic engagement from our planners. Everything I do in my job is either demanded by the residents or developers, or is told to me by a counselor. As government employees, we don't get to make decisions on what our priorities are, and needs to come from an outside source. Many of the planners I've spoken to have not heard engaged citizens talking and speaking and advocating for protection and conservation of our agricultural lands. So call to action for us all to really demand that our agricultural lands are being taken into consideration in our long range planning efforts. Thank you.
Great, those were excellent presentations. Thank you all so much. I'm gonna walk around and I'm happy to bring you the microphone if you would like to ask.
Diana.
Oh, I'm sorry, Diana. Yeah, okay. And I was just happy to bring you the microphone.
Well, thank you. Hi, I'm Diana Hammer. I live here in Helena, and I'm with Resilient Helena. And so I was, and actually that your last comment there was perfect. So Resilient Helena was formed a few years ago to engage the community. So you're just talking about community engagement, so important. Mark Judeman, who's here, Max Milton, who's here, and McKenna Sellers, some other familiar names and faces, have been involved in Resilient Helena for when we started in 2019, so I guess we're almost 5 years old. We recently got our 501c3 status, but we formed because we know there's a lot of really good things happening in Helena, lots of good organizations, and we wanted to help connect and collaborate and amplify those voices as we work together in a changing climate to create a more resilient and thriving community. And so how can we do that? So we've held some Learn and Act series of events, and we'll be holding an irrigation rain barrel workshop and xeriscaping workshop in the spring, and then supporting the city's conservation board, which advises the city on climate action and sustainability, and trying to amplify and build that public support. So when the conservation board makes a recommendation to the city commission, we can have this outpouring of public support, and we help support some of the city's clean energy goals. So Helena is one of the cities in Montana that has 100% clean electricity goal by 2030. We have a waste reduction goal by reduce our waste by 50% by 2040, but the city is not acting. So we need to hear from an outside source to tell the city that these are things the city cares about, and we want to see more of it. And so, and then we also, and this is for everybody, not just in Helena, but this state of Montana just recently got a $3 million grant to come up with a preliminary climate action plan. And they'll be developing that over the next few months. And in the spring, that's phase 1. And in the spring, phase 2 will be implementation. And anything that is any climate action that is outlined in the city or in the state's plan, municipalities then can apply for funding for those specific actions. So it's important to engage in that process so that the state's climate action plan is robust and broad, like a really wide umbrella. So it'll enable us to take action to protect our resources, look at clean energy and all of that. And so if you have any questions, Mark Schumann, Max, and I are all in this room. And I have stickers if anything wants.
Stickers. Diana, do you want to tell them about the meeting, isn't there a public meeting on the climate action plan on Monday, DEQ?
Yes, there is. That's a great idea. So Monday, October 23rd at 3 o'clock, if you go on Montana DEQ's website, you can participate in their rollout of the preliminary climate action plan and how they plan to address it, and opportunities for public involvement. So please engage, because we really need to, we really need to push our elected officials and our staff, public staff, to do the right thing. And then they need to hear from us. Thank you. Okay.
Great. Are there any questions for our panelists or Diana?
Break the ice.
Hi, I live in Belgrade. So,
Great.
Thinking about some of the things that Amaia was talking about, it's hard to translate from like where we are in Belgrade and what's happening there to the agrihood concept, and I'm just seeing so much of that area just get like there's just no plan at all. And so I would love to understand as a concerned citizen, like I don't even know where to start to like become involved in helping our community think a little bit more broadly beyond like this high density where they have a donut in Belgrade now that they're talking about. So I would just love to understand how to like become more involved as a concerned citizen.
Excellent question. Garrett, you want to take that? Your home turf?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You.
I also live in Belgrade, on the north side of Belgrade, near the Prescott Ranch subdivision, and it's just going bonkers. And I obviously don't work for the city of Belgrade, but they have been doing a lot of planning recently, and they've also been working on a zoning plan for the extraterritorial area around city limits. The county hasn't been super involved in that process yet, but I think to your public engagement question, that's a tough one. I mean, the earlier folks can get involved in the process, the better. So one of the things that's always kind of frustrating for planners is we'll do this whole plan, and then we will start to implement the plan, and something will happen in someone's neighborhood, and they will show up and go, "What the hell are you doing?" And we're like, "Well, it's in the plan from 2 years ago when we did this. Like, we're doing it now." And so people get engaged like too late in the game, and then it just turns into like a public fight. And so I'd rather fight with you guys like at the beginning or / work together at the beginning of the process and like work some of that stuff out in our long range planning documents and think about that. And like anytime there's a development project on any given piece of property, there's going to be some feelings about it. But I think that the more engagement we have earlier in the process, the more we can kind of curb some of that and avoid some of those problems in the future. So the county is starting a future land use map process and a regional housing strategy. So those are two big projects that we're doing together concurrently that are coming up and kicking off really soon. So keep an eye on the county's webpage for opportunities there.
Isn't that attitude of where the public should get involved early on and, you know, not fight about a particular project when it comes forward? And, you know, when you do that, you're just labeled an NIMBY. Isn't that I'm playing devil's advocate, sort of. Isn't that an attempt to silence people from being active participants in their community? And can't they be bringing ideas forward at that point that you may not have thought of?
No, I think so, definitely. And like I said, I think anytime there's a development project on a specific parcel, there has to be some public engagement about that because it does have real impacts on people who live in the area, of course. And so, but I do think there's kind of a balance to be struck there because we can't just do public participation one parcel at a time around the county or the city. But yeah, local impacts do matter. So
Great. Did anybody else want to comment on this issue that was just raised? Because okay.
I think you did a great job. Yeah.
Speaking.
Speaking for any engineers in the room on all that are clear probability, we call it trying. First one. Secondly is really, you guys need to be planning for 750,000 to 1 million people living in the Gallatin Valley. Just step out front, be honest about it. It's going to happen. You know, is it going to happen next year? Probably not, obviously. But you know, a plan needs to have a target. And again, speaking for the engineers in the vicinity, it will be engineered. And the question is, who is going to do the engineering? And what are the specifications to that engineered plan? And the first step is to define the boundary, Gallatin Valley. Second is, what's the target? 750,000 people. That's what Denver is. So.
Mark, and then Nathan. Oh, and this. Oh, okay.
You think because you were close by.
So at Resilient Helena, we've been kind of interested in this organization called Strong Towns, which it's kind of an interesting combination of progressive new urbanism and fiscal conservatism. And one of the concepts is that sprawling developments, are initially paid for by the developer or whatever, the infrastructure that's put in. But the cost of maintenance of that is going to be much higher than the tax base for that development can ever support. So I guess my question is, are there ways to front load the cost of that would result in those developments being less of a good idea, less of a developer's dream, and how can we do that?
Thanks, Mark. I think one of the things that comes to mind quickly for me is that that the developments that are going in have to have more skin in the game in what the cost of putting that development in. And I don't mean, they do, there's some shares that they have to come up with, but as you're pointing out, here, I'll stand up so I can see you. It's that it is kind of a Ponzi scheme, right? So there's money and they go, oh yeah, well, we want to develop, and then the development gets pushed out, and as it gets further away, they realize, oh, well, it costs more to get, city services out there, thinking transportation services or police or fire or schools and school buses. And what are those costs? Are the people that are buying the lots, they're actually paying what the full cost is? No, but I think that if the developer, and I hate doing that because this isn't about anti-development, but there needs to be some fewer incentives for them to be developing out there. So if they had to put in the water and sewer systems for each of those lots, we could actually decrease the size of the lots, and then they wouldn't have to go so far. We need to be able to grow. I grew up in Albuquerque, and I would recommend that that's not the design that we want to see, right? I spent my entire childhood and, junior high years in a car. We couldn't walk to a grocery store, couldn't walk to school, it was a great distance, and that's not what we want to see in Montana. So we have to think about just doing it slowly and incrementally, but pay for those costs as they're incurred, rather than putting it down the road. Anybody want to add anything?
No.
Okay. All right.
So my question is for Garrett. So I'm curious with the growth policy that is designed to preserve agricultural soils. Have you had any success in the county requiring private development to actually preserve prime agricultural soils in a project?
You were at the legislation.
Yeah, the state actually did end up taking that tool away from us. But we sure try hard to do that. We do in our subdivision regulations. Let me back up a little bit. Not everything from our growth policy and our policy documents translates to our regulatory documents. And the regulatory documents are where we can make our policy documents happen, right? That's like the implementation. So we're still in the process of trying to update our regulatory documents, subdivision regulations, zoning. There's more than half the county is unzoned. We have a lot of bad zoning in the county. So, but just as a kind of a specific example with like open space and parkland, we have requirements in our subdivision regulation that a developer has to dedicate a certain amount of public space, parkland, but we only can require quantity, not quality. So they give us crap, like it's parkland that's awful that nobody, it's just like a strip of land off the edge of a subdivision that is kind of near the road or whatever. And it's like, well, thanks for the parkland that nobody wants to use. So, and we haven't quite figured out how to develop criteria that requires high quality parkland as part of a subdivision. So those are some of the challenges that we face.
Could you then require that it's more like an agrihood, or that it actually has some food production? I love this idea that you're promoting, Amaia. I don't know.
Yeah, so with our growth policy and some of those policies that we talked about, we want to try to incorporate some of those policies into our regulatory documents so that you have options. You don't have to dedicate a playground as park space. It can be active agricultural plot maybe, or something like that. So yeah, we're trying to get sort of creative with how we can get that open space from subdivisions and also just the quality of it and what it looks like. We also have a lot of wildlife concerns too, so you can dedicate open space for wildlife if there's like wildlife activity on the property.
Lizards.
Totally, yeah.
Well, Missoula County did zoning around the city of Missoula, kind of in the peri-urban area. And the agricultural zoning, allows you to develop, but only if you cluster, and then you get rewarded for that. You get greater density, but you have to retain the agricultural land. And zoning is, we all need to zone. And actually, the remarkable thing about the Missoula County incident, what really blew me away, was there was barely any opposition. I just expected it to be opposed like crazy. And it wasn't, because they did such a good job. And I'm not just saying that because they're my friends, but they are.
I was trying to tease apart like this 4-part question and make it clear. And one was really starting with Anne's statement. I live in the Gallatin Valley. My name's Kate. And there's this myth we all live with of the dissonance between the city and the county. And so I wanted to hear Garrett's thought on whether that is shifting. There's been a lot of time and effort put in, particularly around the triangle, and wondering if that's shifting.
Yeah,
That's one.
I think so. We have a group called the PCC, the Planning Coordination Committee, which is Belgrade. And it's not just planners, it's the development directors. So it's the heads of the department, elected officials as well. So it's folks who are high up and have, skin in the game. It's not just like a representative or a lower level staff member or whatever. So I think that gives it a little bit more legitimacy in my mind. But we work on, sort of regional planning issues for the triangle. We wrote a triangle plan, sort of like a mini growth policy, the Triangle Trails Plan in partnership with GVLT, our local land organization. So yeah, there's some good stuff happening, I think.
And I guess as a follow-up to that, the whole idea of state policy influencing what we can do locally. And I know there used to be a smart growth group in Montana that was making headway until it went away. I don't know if anyone wants to address where that is now, and if there is, that community still exists, and if they're starting to work with the ag community, ag and food community to be a stronger, more collaborative force.
So sadly, the Smart Growth Coalition is not still viable or acting, but they did have some really great ideas. And I do want to address the preemptive, the state coming in and telling the localities what they can do, because it's a really touchy subject. And at the legislature, it was a really difficult one for me to navigate, because I believe in local control, and I think it's vital. I feel like locally, the people know what they need and how they should do that. And in places where that's working, that's a good thing. But in places where it isn't working, it becomes a problem. And I use an example that came to mind was, say you have a city zoning meeting where they want to eliminate single family zoning in some neighborhood. And they do that at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Who are the people that show up for that meeting to have that conversation with the city commission? Is it the people that really need the homes in that, in increasing that density in that area? Are they really having a well-balanced conversation and representation when that happens? And so there has to be the political will. And if the commissioners are saying all we're hearing from are the people who already own the homes in that neighborhood, then they don't change anything. And so at some point, does the state have to have some sort of broader guidelines that they are creating incentives or telling the cities some minimum things that they need to do? So it's kind of
talking about those.
no, it was another city somewhere.
Yeah, right.
And then just one last one that I thought was really interesting, and it was some of the pushback to in Bozeman,
the changes to single family residences. And there was a gentleman who got up and said, why can't some of our HOAs and POAs take some of the pressure for density? Why are they exempt? Because you've created these spaces that you described are so well are like on 1 acre. The infrastructure now is what it is, which isn't healthy for, anyway, so that conundrum of equitably distributing the additional housing is an interesting one that's super complex.
The one thing that I would just add to that is this whole conversation about middle housing, and it's really thinking about building smaller what we used to think of as starter homes. And where do we do that? There was one bill in the legislature this last session that said that you have to allow an accessory dwelling unit anywhere that you have single family zoning. So that was a big change. The other one was Senate Bill 323 that said in the cities that are 5,000 people or greater, you have to allow anywhere you have single family zoning, that you have to allow duplexes and triplexes.
Well, so, okay, I want to kind of let's go deeper on this question of local control because, those kinds of bills, especially the latter, in my mind are really problematic. If you believe in planning, if you believe that we should look at what the services a particular neighborhood can support, then you can't be doing planning by fiat from over there. And it really worries me. And what it worries me especially is that too many of my friends who are on the, I consider myself to be on the left. So do they, but they're pushing for these things as well as the development community. And I think it's really problematic. If you believe in planning, it has to happen at the local level.
So I think that's an excellent point, and I was on the Montana Association of Planners Board of Directors, and this last legislative session, as we were preparing for it, we had a lot of conversations about that, and some of them were kind of tense, and we got together and we made, this was partly my idea with some others and sort of like workshopping this thing, but we made a conscious choice to change our tactics a little bit. In the past, we've always been against preemption. Doesn't really matter what the issue is. We fight anything that is preemption. And this legislative session, we changed that idea because we thought, listen, there's this housing crisis. There's a lot going on. If the state brings us a good idea, or if we think it aligns with our planning principles, we'll support it, even if it's preemption. And that's kind of what ended up happening with the ADU bill and a couple others. We were like, all right, you can have this one state, like, tell us what to do, because generally it aligns with what we're trying to do locally. But it's a really tough, it was a real, and some, it was tough.
Yeah, I bet. Are there other questions? Mr. Logan?
All we do is people great presentations. And I wanted to thank you for an almost impossible job. What Ann said, she believes in local control. And Neva also said, if you believe in planning. Those are two opposite poles. Watch the Bitter Valley. They don't want planning. Well, they don't have planning. North Helena, no planning, and they're soon going to be drinking everybody's food. Rick in the room, engineer, who takes the big picture look at all this stuff, which planners have to do too. We had an interesting workshop in Missoula. I'm a green builder from Missoula, and I got some ideas about how to fund this. But when we had a group session, 300 people showed up, and they basically said 50,000 people will be moving to Missoula in the next 20 years. Where will you put them?
Yes.
This is not the bitter. This is just Missoula. This is 20 years ago. And it was really interesting in that room to see how many people had common agreements on where to put 50,000 people and how to do it. Open space, we value rivers, riparian zones, we value ag land, we value. So what else do you do? And at every table, 10 or 12 people at each table, we came up with common answers for where to cluster, or to put residential above commercial. I mean, the ideas that were stewing in that room were very interesting. But the premise was 50,000 people were going to be moving to Missoula Valley. His statement, planning for 700,000 to 1 million people, is probably true. And if that's in fact true, we better get our shit together and figure out where we're going to put them and how we're going to house them, because they will be coming. In Missoula, the Missoula Redevelopment Agency was the tax incremental fund, you know about this, to offer money to incentivize putting people in derelict areas, blighted areas. So they put a bike trail through a very blighted part of Missoula and incentivized clustered commercial mixed residential along that blighted bicycle trail. Well, that bicycle trail wasn't used for a decade. I loved it, rollerblading, bicycling, for a decade. And now all of a sudden it's extremely busy because I helped build some green cluster developments along that bike trail. And I thought, God, this is a great idea. Why wouldn't you do this? Now it's very popular. So they incentivize that with taxing and financing. But I also think with all the real estate transactions going on every day in Montana, there ought to be a 0.5%, 1% fee on all of those transactions over 300,000, over 400,000 to help buy the money needed to do long-range planning for lots of people that will either sprawl or grow into a planned area where we value ag, river, or whatever, and still have to put people in because they will be coming.
Unfortunately, the Montana Association of Realtors got a constitutional amendment to make it so we can never have a realty transfer tax in the state of Montana. We can change that. Okay. More to do. Did you guys want to respond to?
This one's for my Helena people. Last year I was all ready to put an ADU on my property. I had an old carriage house that needs to come down anyways, and I thought it would be a great idea to help solve the infill issue in Helena. Had a visit with the city planning office, and in the end, the ordinances that were required were basically prohibited. Somebody else had already had a variance, and it just wasn't gonna happen. So I guess that's my question. And I know resilient Helena is more focused on climate, and but this is part of the issue as well, right? Housing in Helena. How do we deal with that when local control just isn't cutting it? They're not coming around fast enough. And for somebody like me, who had the, bank of family to rely on and had the opportunity and was ready to move forward with it, it just wasn't, in the end, it wasn't workable because of those ordinances. So
I think I would just say that that's what I was trying to point out, right? Is that it is more that sometimes the zoning laws and the rules and the ordinances or the building codes are really putting a damper on people who want to be creative and say, I want to do this. And it actually is zoned so that you're allowed to do that. But there are other pieces and parts that make it too challenging for you to be able to complete that. And that's part of this two-sided approach, right? We need to think about quit making it so easy to sprawl and quit making it so difficult to do something, to do infill with willing landowners in town. And how do we create those incentives? What are they? What's the kinds of things Steve's talking about? What does that planning need to look like? And how do we identify where we can do that infill? But I don't know how you do it, right? So then we get to the question of the legislature. And you don't want the state to be dictating what getting into very prescriptive zoning and regulations in cities. The state needs to be broad-minded. So it's a tough nut to crack.
Yeah. Well, it rubbed me the wrong way. So
I'm sorry.
I'm ready to visit with whoever is in the kind of lead the charge in Helena on maybe changing some of those local ordinances. So it's a little bit more friendly.
I'm in a very walkable neighborhood and there's no need for the number of parking spaces that are required. So.
Yeah, I would just add, like, I don't know about Helena, but a lot of zoning in the county is crap. Like, it's bad zoning, we just have a lot of really bad zoning. And so I think that's a big part of the conversation, is reforming zoning and making it make sense. There's so much zoning that makes no sense. We regulate things that should not be regulated. And then we don't regulate things that we need to be regulating, and it drives me crazy.
With this bill that you mentioned, or that earlier.
The ADU bill.
Would that help?
I'm wondering if that, I mean, I wonder what kind of impact that would have on the city of Helena. Like, bus driver
I
voice,
called it for you.
Possibly so, yeah.
So I got pretty involved in the county's process for Bozeman Valley, and we came out with a blank ordinance. And, okay, so, no backup, so then I Googled the first paragraph of the code. And it was word for word from the 1960 state of Maryland zoning code. I mean, and people that were doing it weren't dumb people. But so where I'm gonna go with this, and on your problem here, I've talked to many people about how we can get more growth in the city limits on services rather than the valley. And whether it's a developer or, you know, someone that Habitat for Humanity, we have a culture of no in the staff. And I think it happens, and there's a lot of reasons for it. It's not necessarily, it's not about individuals, it's about the culture. It's about not having money to hire the people to do this. But this really is unacceptable, because the growth policy wanted more density in town. So the only way I see through this, and this is where I think, getting back to Errol's charge to us, how do we get more community engagement around everybody eating, is we have to find ways with our traditional membership organizations to kind of come together to create a critical mass of citizens to just show up regularly to say to the city elected officials, what can we do to help your staff become a culture of yes instead of a culture of no? So take the blame off. And I think that's what we have to figure out. And Errol said next year we want to have a plan to do this. So I'm throwing the challenge out to all of us.
I'm on board, because I hate doing development review. So if I could do less of that, that would be great.
Yeah.
And then less public fighting about everything. So I like your idea and I'm on board.
Hi, thank you guys for your really wonderful and visionary ideas. Like, I'm a young person here in Montana, and like, I love seeing projects like this because it's totally like aligned with my vision for like a sustainable future, and I think that's really wonderful. But also, like, I'm curious how affordability and access gets baked into these ideas, because I'm 23, I have $5,000 in my bank account, like, the median price for a home is $400,000. Like, how am I gonna be able to access that? Projects?
You can, yeah, super feel that.
Yes, I want to stand up and
Oh, yeah.
tell us how they're gonna afford this.
Yeah, so I have all of the solutions. No, I think that especially with, I mean, something like an agrihood, they do not have, there's an extent to the incentives that the city can actually propose to developers. That was a bill passed in 2015 that really regulates the extent to which the city can incentivize affordable housing development. And currently there's a cap on the LIHTC low-income housing tax credits that can be distributed, at least in Bozeman. So there are other strategies looking to the county and looking to the city who have access to municipal bonds in order to create a public housing authority, because a public housing authority is required when there is a lack of safe and sanitary housing, which if you live in Bozeman, you know that that is abundantly true. So a public housing authority would basically be able to access municipal bonds in order to develop public housing that would stay permanently affordable, because currently those HUD vouchers, the LIHTC, the Section 8, Section 9 have a time limitation. So the housing that is built there may be affordable for 10, 15, 20 years, but is not permanently affordable because after that voucher session is over, it then just gets swallowed up by developers. So that is one strategy, is that if a public housing authority could cooperate to build some sort of agrihood model, that would be really great. It involves like cross subsidization. So if you have like one building, basically all of the units are different priced. Basically no one in any unit would pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. And then since it's a nonprofit model, all of the rent money would go back into the maintenance of that building and potentially create a pool of funding to build more public housing. So that is one strategy and solution I see as being quite possible. And we've had a lot of conversations with both the city and the county looking at a public housing authority as a strategy we have not used yet, but something certainly that could be in the toolkit to actually build permanently affordable housing. But will this agrihood developer integrate affordable housing? They currently don't have many incentives to do so. So I don't know. Yeah.
So thinking about that, when you're talking about affordability, and this conversation comes up a lot, and I heard, I was at the Helena's Habitat for Humanity fundraiser the other night, and Jacob Kuntz stood up and said that 80% of the people that live in Helena would qualify for a Habitat for Humanity home. The median home price in Montana right now is $527,000. The median annual income is $63,000. We could do some simple math on that. It's not working. At the legislature, when they talk about affordability, the developers and the realtors are there saying, let's cut regulations so we can build because we just need to have more units. But what they're not saying is the kinds of homes that they're building are not affordable homes, and they're not necessarily energy efficient. So what we need to do is be rethinking this idea of what kinds of homes do people live in. And I have found myself rethinking mobile home parks. And I'm like, those were brilliant. Like, those are actually a really good idea. And what about if we took those mobile homes and replaced them and recycled them with manufactured energy efficient homes and allowed those people that live there to enter into a community land trust where they were no longer vulnerable to somebody coming from out of state, a private equity firm, where their home becomes a liability after their rent gets doubled and they've got their 1976 mobile home that they don't know what in the world they're going to do with. So the question becomes equity and justice and thinking about all of our community members and how do we provide a variety of homes that are not all 1,500 to 3,000 square foot single family homes on a lot with a lot of yard, right? So we need to re-envision what does that look like and have a variety of opportunities and places for those homes to be built and for the next generation to begin to build their generational wealth through home ownership. But we're not doing it right now. And we absolutely have to rethink this.
Oh, yeah.
I get my.
Okay, I think we're, unfortunately, Tommy didn't get his comment in, but maybe we can catch your ear or